Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we are joined by Ashleigh Wallace. So Ashleigh is lead physiotherapist at British Equestrian and also athlete health consultant at EIS, English Institute of Sport. So Ash, thank you very much for joining.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Andy. I'm really excited to have a chat.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So talk about, you obviously got an accent. Where are you from originally?
Originally from South Africa. So born in a little place called Bloemfontein, and then but grew up. I spent sort of my first 30 years in Cape Town. So that's where I'm from originally.
Right. I was meant to be going to South Africa in 10 days, but that's definitely off now.
Yeah,
so.
it's on the red list. I'm meant to be going. Well, I was hoping to go back for a month in November, but I think that's looking less and less likely as it does stay in the red list, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So
in terms of that then, so at what point did you start doing what you were doing there? So like when did you start doing physio? Was that when you were based over there?
Yeah. So fortunately for me, it was a passion and a calling from when I was really, really young. So I always, growing up, was really sporty and played a lot of sports and rode horses and played hockey and you name it, did it, surfed, all the rest of it. And then when I finished school, I was chosen to be an exchange student. So when I matriculated, I had applied to do medicine and then was accepted to be an exchange student to go to America for a year. And that, to be honest, in many ways changed my life. Fantastic experience. But also when I was there, it was, dare I say it, a long time ago. So it was the LA 84 Olympics. And I was introduced to someone I was based near to Johns Hopkins University and hospital, and I met a physio there who was working with the American long jumpers. I remember going, and they were doing it as part of a sort of a student exposure to the hospital, and they showed us around. And we met this guy, and he was showing me how he was looking at how you can change, if you change an athlete's dorsiflexion, it can change the length they could jump. And I was like, that's what I want to do. That is absolutely what I want to do. And I came back home and said to my folks, I've changed my mind. I want to study physio. Didn't even look at what physio entailed. All of the medical side of things, applied and started studying in a place called Stellenbosch. The University of Stellenbosch is where I started out. So, I mean, anatomy was always a passion. It still is of mine. And I'm really passionate that you understand anatomy, you can work up pretty much anything. And from a young age, I remember doing Jane Fonda exercise videos, and so exercise has been a huge part of my life. And I see you laughing, and fair enough, I shouldn't admit to that, should I? And I was, I'm very lucky, a career that I chose and loved.
Yeah, great. So you were based in the Baltimore area then?
I was, yes, absolutely right. So a place called Westminster, which was just north of Baltimore, but really, really close. And as I say, very lucky to be exposed to travel and be exposed to John, as I say, the age of 17, 18 years old, which was influenced my career without a doubt. Without a doubt.
No, it's an incredible institution, Johns Hopkins, isn't it? It's amazing.
Mind blowing.
Yeah, a good friend of mine's the director of outpatients there, so I'll have to introduce you to him. So
yes.
he does a lot of work with athletes out there, whether it's pro sports teams, but also in terms of like runners and so on. So
well, they were doing really, and as I said, back in '84, and they were doing some really sort of novel and innovative work with at the time the long jumpers, the American long jumpers, and it just blew me away. It was absolute. And I can remember many years later when I was. So I in South Africa, I worked actually, when I qualified, I worked in a hospital. I worked with head injuries. I worked with burns because I had a scholarship to work back. So, and at that stage, I was just getting into playing international hockey. So I played hockey for South Africa. So my sort of career was on a back burner. And then I did my postgraduate master's in South Africa and in sports medicine. But I was always at that stage really focused on my career as a hockey player. And it was when I came over here and I started eventually kind of many years down the line in 2003, I was cycling around Dorney Lake when I was working with British Rowing. And I remember it was this amazing, beautiful flat water and working with the rowers, cycling with the coach, chatting about why someone wasn't quite able to get their rock over. I remember phoning my sister and saying, I can't, that dream I had back in '84, almost 20 years later, I'm doing exactly what I wanted to do. A long way to get there, but I've had, it certainly chose me without a doubt.
No, that's incredible then. So at what point did you stop becoming an athlete then, or like what point did that end?
When I was told I was too old, so we obviously were in well, not obviously, but I was in the apartheid era for much of my career, and then in '93 when apartheid ended, we were really lucky to get back into playing international hockey. So I played a lot of international hockey then, and we had a wild card entry to try and qualify for the '96 Olympics, and we just missed it by one place. And at that stage, I definitely put my hockey career first, and I was in business at a private practice, and that was certainly coming second. And I thought, well, if I stay for another 4 years, I'll be, it's not quite over the hill, but I thought at some stage I need to really crack down and start focusing what I want to do career-wise. So in '96, '97, I retired from playing hockey, and then really focused and came over to England. Actually, my mum was originally from Northern Ireland, so I could get an ancestry visa, and my plan was absolutely to travel Europe, do as many courses as I could, because there was certainly a dearth of CPD, of international, certainly lecturers coming to South Africa. And then my plan was always to go back and go back to the practice, and that was
Right.
26 years ago. So I was 25 years ago, so that didn't quite go to plan.
Yeah.
But when I started working, I was really lucky. I started working with Bupa, and worked at Bupa Bushy, and they had quite a big sports injury setup. We were working then with Watford because they had Saracens Rugby were there, and I started getting involved back in the day in Cybex testing with those guys. And I worked at Bupa for 7 years, which was fantastic, absolutely fantastic introduction to working in England. And they were a brilliant company to work for, and really supported my development in this country.
Right. And just going back into that then, what was it like playing sport in apartheid then?
Well, it was interesting because I look back now and I think of, and often people say to me, how could you play when you had nothing to aim for? And, we didn't have World Cups to aim for. We didn't have Olympic Games to aim for when I was playing, but it was so, South Africa is just a absolutely sport crazy country. So to get your provincial colours was huge to get selected. And when I first got selected for the South African indoor hockey team, we played against our B team. We didn't play against any international side. And I think a year later, we used to often play against, much the same as in rugby and cricket, you'd have these rebel touring sides, and we would have the same as sort of hockey players that had given up their career, and they were going to come play against us. But I have to say, it was so competitive. And it was, even though you didn't have that as something, it was just, I wanted to be the best in the province. I wanted to be in the top, in those days, top 16 in the country. And that was, bizarrely, now when I think about it, and I think how focused athletes are about actually, you haven't achieved anything unless you've actually played a test match, or you've gone to a World Cup or an Olympics. But for us, that was all we had. So that's what you focused on and did your best, and was so competitive, unbelievably competitive. So that was, as I say, very, very competitive still, and still felt amazing when you achieved the top of your sport that you could.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously when it was announced, when apartheid ended, and then the sanctions against us were lifted, oh my word, that was amazing. And the first time we left South Africa, so we had the first team to come over and play us was Canada, I think, and then we had Australia, and then after the '92 Olympics, the Great Britain team had split up into England. This is the hockey team, and they came over and played us, and that was again probably a fantastic competition, because I made some of my best friends today were in that team, and because we were so hungry of meeting some of these iconic players that we'd only seen on television, and sometimes getting sort of DVD or videos in those days to training things. I then, when I came over here, I played for Slough, and many of those players have gone on to be some of my closest friends. So it's this kind of serendipity, really, where playing hockey when I came over to England also helped me, I think, settle in this country and make friends for life.
Yeah. And were you, because you were a physio, were you drafted in to be like strapping players up, and was that?
Yes. I mean, we had a physio. We did have a physio in the team, but I definitely would get. I used to do quite a lot of acupuncture back then, and So I would get drafted in to help do some acupuncture and do some treatment. And I sometimes reflect on my career as a hockey player, and I would definitely had this dual role, and I often think, perhaps if I just focused, I might have had a longer career as a hockey player if I just focused on being a hockey player and not also doing physio at the same time. But absolutely no regrets, and yes, often did land up helping out the physio when there was carnage and loads of injuries that needed treating.
Yeah, unpaid internship.
Exactly right. And I, it's something that I talk to young physios now, is that that internship went on at the same time as me playing internationally, but also when I finished I then sort of worked as a physio for the South African team when I retired, before I came over to England. So yeah, it was a long internship.
Yeah, I can imagine. So you moved over to Spa. So did you need to get sponsored to come here when you moved?
No, I had because my mom was
of course, yeah,
Northern Ireland, so I got what we call British ancestry visa, which allowed me to live and work here for 4 years, and then you apply for permanent residency, and then finally passport. So yes, and I had a real. So my dad was South African, mom had a British passport throughout. So a little bit of a mongrel really of Irish descent and South African.
Yeah. So after you'd been at Bupa Bushy, then what happened next?
EIS. So I was, and again, people always say to me, what's your sort of 5-year plan, and talk me through how you made those plans. And honestly, I'd never planned I'd never heard of the English Institute of Sport back in 2003. And I have a very good friend to thank for that, who at the time was physio for the England hockey team. And she phoned me, Mary McAllister's her name, and Mary phoned me to say, Ash, there's an advert in the Guardian for this company called the English Institute of Sport, and they're opening up at Bisham Abbey, and there's a job going there. They want someone to set it up, and it's working with hockey and judo and rowing, and I think you should look at that. I was like, well, I've never even watched rowing. I don't even know nothing about rowing. Hockey, yes. Judo, also have got no idea. But cut a long story short, applied, and at that stage was in two minds, because I was at that real, which happens to a lot of physios, and Bupa were really pushing me. I was heading up the department then, and they said, well, they wanted to fast track me through an MBA, and that's what I started doing, my MBA. My father fell ill with cancer and sadly passed away, but actually, again, I think to this day, I started doing my MBA, and I always thought that's what I wanted to do, and I just realized how much I missed being a clinician, and I was pulled away into more and more management and less clinical work. And when the role came up with the EIS, I thought, actually, I really do miss it. I'd only stepped away from clinical work for about 18 months or 2 years, but I realized that actually my real passion is clinical work. So I applied for the job, bought a few books on rowing, and learned very quickly about rowing, and got the job. So that was back in 2003, where English Institute was just starting out as an institute, and I think my number is 46. I was the 46th person that was employed, and just amazing, amazing to start at Bisham with Jean Watson I still work with, and the guys who. There was just 4 of us that started, so S&C, physiologist, Dr. Richard Budgett, who now heads up the IOC, and that was the group that started at Bisham many years ago, well, almost 20 years ago now, or 19 years ago.
What was it like then going in there? Like, what was the infrastructure? What was there?
Nothing compared to what it's like now. So at the time, Bisham was obviously really well known for being a base for football in those days. And it was basically, it was still being built, and really it was an unknown. They just, the institute was really starting. So we had these what they call regional areas, and at that stage hockey wasn't based at Bisham, so there was no centrally based sport. We were working with shooting that were based down in Bisley, sailing, who obviously still down south and still are there, and the whole idea was to try and, how do you create services that you can best support these athletes? So very different to the model now. I was basically a multi-sport physio, so my job was to primarily work with the British rowing women's team, who were based at Longridge, just around the corner, and was to put in services. Up until then, most of the sports had worked with contractors, so they wouldn't have any day-to-day support. They would just have support when they were on camps or at competition. So what we were trying to build was actually, how can we pull them into having regular support, physio initially. Again, I smile in that they didn't want any strength and conditioning. Strength and conditioning back in those days, particularly in rowing, was coach-led. So, and I kept saying, we've got a really good strength and conditioning coach, but it had to be physio and coach at that time. Hockey, as I say, was not a centralized sport at that stage. They were based all over the place, so at clubs, and would come into a squad training. So it was trying to really, and certainly the vision of those of us that were there were actually, if you make these sites really good, the sports will come. So if you have the right facilities, and then you offer the right services, and that's in fact what has happened, is you've got these big hub sites. Bisham is a huge hub site. We started off with myself being one physio and servicing hockey, rowing, and the judo academy, to now having, I think we now put 89, 90 staff on site, with a centralized sport, rowing and hockey, and then obviously loads of other sports accessing that as a site. So it was amazing, really, because I mean we worked in a, and I think I always reflect on it, because in 2003, obviously we were 1 year away from the games, from 2004. And at that time, those rowers, we had a makeshift gym, which was up in one of the indoor tennis courts. We didn't have the fantastic facilities we have now, but they got in there, still did the work, lifted the same weights. And 2004, every single female athlete delivered a medal in Athens. So, whilst we had the facilities, it was also about just starting to put in consistent services. And it's been a wonderful journey to go through the journey of the institute developing to what it is now from where it was. But I still, and for me, it's always about you recruit the right people, and the rest will come.
And how do you find it in terms of like the change? You're the only physio there now, so now you've got a big team. Like what are the pros and cons of both?
I think for one thing, being the only physio, obviously you split yourselves, and some people may say you're not specialist enough in a sport, which is a fair comment to make. I always, when I'm very grateful for being able to cut my teeth that way, because I think I've always been passionate about, as I said earlier in the podcast, about anatomy. And if you've got your basics and your knowledge, it's how you apply that to sport. The actual specifics of the sport, you've got a vast amount of knowledge from coaches and from experts within a sport. You bring in your expertise, your clinical expertise. And that's what I think is really important. If you've got good clinical skills and good anatomical knowledge, you bring that into a sport, and then you can learn the specifics of the requirements of the sport. And I think those things are easy to learn. The other side of things with respect to having good clinical insight and good clinical skills have to be honed and learned over a longer period of time, if that makes sense. And I can certainly talk from experience, because I've worked in quite a few sports. So I think the pros then, I mean, it was so much less professional than it is now. So that the pros were that you had a broad base of exposure to many different sports. The cons of that certainly where like anything, you're dividing yourself up, so you can't give undivided attention to certain sports, and perhaps give your specific energy into specific sports. Nowadays, you have the real ability to immerse yourself in a sport and become a real expert. The con of that, and where we have to be careful, is if you stay in that sport for years and years and years, is you do de-skill. So, for example, if you work in a sport like rowing, which is you often see your chronic injuries, you don't see very many acute injuries, and you'll see an overloading type, overuse type injury, then your ability to manage an acute ankle, for example, or an acute shoulder dislocation, those skills will be less developed because you don't get exposed to that. So I think nowadays there is that pressure to go down a specialist area as in a sport, but then that de-skills you, and that's fine if you're going to stay in that sport for your whole career. but often I think, and for me, a sort of a healthy cycle would be that 8 to 10 year cycle, and then move on. It's important to keep still exposing yourself so you develop a whole set of skills.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, it definitely does. No, it definitely does. I mean, you can see that from visiting each of the different sites, and it's an impressive setup. Like,
yeah.
You got such a, that now you're talking about S&C. Like, at what point did you start to see S&C being more widely accepted?
I think it was probably in the cycle, not so much the 2004 cycle, but I think where we really saw that again momentum was in the cycle up into the build up of Beijing. And I think, if you look at the trajectory of the success of Team GB, of that Olympic journey, you saw, I think when we started on that journey, you really saw 2008, that those athletes arriving on that stage being physically in really, really good shape. And that was very obvious. It was certainly the journey at that stage for me when I was working with the British women's hockey team and England women, is that was our focus. Our focus was on developing physically robust athletes. And I think that was, we saw that huge, if I kind of look at the cycles where we developed as a system, that was where it started to take traction. And I think we saw that massive influence of being able to have a consistent and actually well thought out strength and conditioning program. That's just, as you say, it's just continued to develop and develop. But that's where the real infancy and the start of it was, and where we started to see impact. And I think valuing, as I said, that the conversation when I started in 2003, where the coach we don't want a strength and conditioning coach, I do the strength and conditioning. And it took 2 years to convince the coach that actually we do need to bring all these different skills. And now, as you know, we have a big multidisciplinary team. We've got psychologists, we've got performance lifestyle, we've got a huge array of skills, which, as long as you integrate them well, is very, very effective. One has to be careful that they're not siloed, but if it's integrated, it actually has a huge impact on our athletes and on the sport.
Yeah, I mean, you still have that. You can have those discussions now about football of, coaches obviously wanting to do things their way, but then you've got science coming in. So it's still an ongoing thing, isn't it, really?
It is.
I think EIS seems to have really done a great job of being able to really professionalize that and structure it as well.
Yes, absolutely. I think that sort of argument between art and science is always there. And I think it's always, often people ask me, is why have you stayed in the Institute as long as you have in different roles? And that's mostly because I really believe in the power of the team altogether. I love working in a team. I love, every day is a learning day. You can't, with the greatest will in the world as a physio and some of the interests that I have, there's just not enough time to learn about whether it's nutrition or whether it's strength and conditioning, but actually working in a team where someone else is delving into, let's say, the impact of vitamin D, or looking at relative energy deficit, and you've got real experts and they come in, so you're learning, you get this vast amount of input of fantastic learning opportunities. And that's what I think, certainly what drives me, is passionate about learning, passionate about doing things differently. How can we continue to evolve? And that's what drives most of us, I think, in the Institute. I'd be surprised if someone coming into an institute, into a team environment, if you're not a team player, because it is about actually bringing everyone's best to really have that integrated impact on a sport. And really important, where I think where the issues come sometimes with coaches and support staff, as if support staff going and trying blind with science, and your coaches who come often through a different pathway, is it's just about respecting everyone, what everyone brings to the table. The issues evolve, I think, where you have someone coming and thinking, well, I'm the scientist, I know better. And that's just not the case. We all have something to offer, and it's how you actually, I call it that sort of performance threat, how you take someone through a journey is about all of you having input. What are your insights coming together? And that's difficult to do in big teams, but it is definitely the most effective teams, I think, do that really well. Really well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So in terms of like the first event that you went to then? So was that the Olympics? Was it your first
Yes.
major event?
First major event would be numerous World Cups and World Champs probably, and then the first big event actually was Commonwealth Games. So in my role with the EIS, and that was the 2006 Commonwealth Games in Melbourne, and I went there with hockey.
Yeah.
So
and how did you find that experience then? What was it like going to that?
We're going back now, but I loved it. I think that whole the really interesting thing at any multi-sport is, and anyone will tell you this going to Olympics, is you just see this collection of athletes that you get some exposure to it in the institute, where you're working with hockey one day and then with hockey with rowing the next day, where you've got a 6'7" athlete and someone who's 5'4". So you see the disparity of physical differences, but that multi-sport buzz where there's this real excitement and camaraderie of a bigger team, I think is also what most of us who work in the Olympic arena love, because you get that every 4 years, all of these sports coming together, both as Team GB and indeed the world, which is unique. You go to a World Cup with a sport, with hockey, with rowing, and it clearly is, it's just that one sport I mentioned, but there's multi-sport. It's just a real celebration of sport, I think, which is what I love, and it is very different. I think the different part of that as well is the challenge of keeping athletes and in fact support staff on track with, actually, we've got a job to do, and not you can get easily distracted with all the noise and the excitement around these big games. But Melbourne was, I mean, a fantastic first big games to go to, because they did it brilliantly, absolutely brilliantly. And it's that, the first time you're going to what I thought was a huge eating hall, was nothing compared to the games 2 years later, but the first time you're exposed to that, this is just amazing, because you're normally in a hotel where you go and have your meals when you at a World Cup or at a World Championships, but this becomes, and again, as I say, that both the attraction but also the distraction of that is that you can eat what you like when you like, and I'm not talking about athlete, I'm talking about sports staff as well. You could go crazy and just have food 24/7 and whatever you like whenever you like. So there's lots of distractions in multisport, and that was good to be exposed to that early on and to take learnings from that. And I think I was very lucky in those days to also work with a support team, really experienced. So I was relatively novice, or not relatively, I'd never been to a big games, and where it's the rest of the team, they were really experienced. So that allowed me to learn, to not make mistakes, to listen to those who've been to multiple, either as players or indeed as coaches or support staff. And that for me was invaluable, is just quietly watching, learning, and thinking, okay, this is how it's done, this is what we do, this is how we prepare a team in an environment which a lot of it you can't control. And I think that's the big message that I'll always share with anyone. You spend so much of your preparation controlling every minutia. We've got better at that. Perhaps you could say there's a pro and con with that, is where we control everything. You control from when people drink, what are we advising them with respect to vitamins, how much you sleep. We do wellness monitoring. How do you feel in the morning? All of these things you could be accused of saying are micromanaged, and yet when you go into a big games environment, it's hard to control some of those things. It's hard to control the noise levels, because you'll have people, you'll have boxers out at 4 or 5 in the morning running with their sweats, and you hear them, and there's just noise all the time. So you go from a very controlled environment to an environment where you can't control everything. All you can do is control your reaction to that, and that's where we obviously do a lot of work with our athletes. And that was a big thing for me, is I think that going to that in 2006, going to Melbourne and just thinking, well, you just get there's little coffee vendors at every corner, and it was just so much to do other than your job, if that makes sense. So it's really important that you're disciplined in, actually, we're here to do a job. And that was a great learning to have in 2006 in preparation for Beijing.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. Sounds like a cruise or something. You could just be eating all day.
Oh, totally. It's and you do it's and seriously, I mean, then that was that whole sort of coffee culture starting, and which hadn't really started in England yet. And you had these little, flat whites everywhere that you could literally be having tea, and they were so delicious that by the end of it you're on this caffeine high. I mean, little things like that, but just things that you don't normally do in in normal life. But so we had a fortunately a very experienced management group, not me, but the rest of the group, which we would do early morning smoothies, early morning run, and get into that sort of routine to help you function, which was really important. And I think I think it's so important with sorry to speak there, Andy, but I think it's really important, that mix. It's always a real threat at the end of the games you get, and we're seeing it at the moment, is a lot of people leaving. And that real, and I reflect on my career and how lucky I've been around having, when I started doing those big events, is having really experienced, whether it was coaching staff, or the person we had who was doing all the video analysis was an ex-coach and an ex-international player, and there was so much experience to learn from, and to be not directly mentored, but were absolutely my mentors in how to perform in a multi-sport environment.
Yeah,
I think it's a concern when you see a huge, when there's big turnover and you lose some of that. I think there's a threat there, without a doubt.
Yeah, they were saying that about some of the athletes as well, in terms of that there's quite a high turnover between this one, which is maybe why we didn't win certain ones in certain different disciplines. But in terms of so for what you did then, so what is the structure for you as the support staff? Do you have organised things, or you just get on with yourself? You're sharing rooms? How does that work?
And now or then, or generally?
All of it.
Yeah, it varies. So if I talk about my experience when we work with a team sport, so when I worked with hockey, it was really structured. So you'd have certainly coach led, and we were really well structured. So you'd know days in advance what that looked like, when the training program was there, when we were meeting as a staff. And in many of the teams that I've worked in, we'll have a regular catch up in the evening, the end of the day, to reflect and say, well, okay, where we are at. Certainly from my point of view as a physio, are there any issues, anything we're concerned about, anything we need to back off? And those coming together as that multidisciplinary coach-led meetings are really important, because it's a check-in, also to see where everyone's at, and you can have some pretty torrid days. I reflect back on, and actually really Mike Roster was a doc I worked with in 2008, and he was in Tokyo in the village as the doc that was working in the prep camp. So it was lovely to actually work with him again, and we were reflecting on our Beijing journey, which was tough. We had so many injuries, and again we'd went into that games with a lot of, it's a big lesson learned. We went in thinking we could carry a lot of these hockey players who had niggles, and we thought we'll be fine. We'll carry them through. And it was a tough old games. I think we were the sort of frequent visitors to the polyclinic, and we had to, unfortunately, one of our athletes had an injury that we had to bring our reserve in from outside the village. So some tough decisions, just one injury after another, some really tricky and tough calls that we were reflecting on. And I think that ability for a team to then at the end of the day sit down, sometimes it's 11 o'clock at night, and actually sit down and just say, well, how are you doing, and check in on each other is. And to this day, Mike and I, we haven't worked together for when did I leave hockey? 2010. So we haven't actually worked side by side for 11 years, but there's that real bond that you pick up 11 years later. He's there in prep camp. I can phone him at 10:30 and say, look, I've got an issue. I need to bring a rider down to see you. And there's that, and it's absolutely born of those experiences that you've been through together in what will absolutely, I can remember flying back from Beijing thinking, I can't do this ever again. This was the toughest, it was the toughest 3 weeks of my life. But, having 4 games later, I've continued to do it. So it must be some love and passion there. So I think it's you can't sort of overemphasize the importance of that, of coming together. And again, as I said earlier, is actually everyone having something to offer, because often it may be, I might be coming from a medical point of view and saying, oh yeah, I'm concerned about this person's back or knee or whatever. And someone has from another discipline may have noticed to say, well, actually, have you noticed this, or something else is going on here? And I think there's always wisdom, and sometimes we're quite focused on our individual roles, as it were, and I think it's quite important to get that information from others. So generally how it would work is that's what you would do. Now, if I fast forward to my experience in Tokyo, a really different sport. So in equestrian, not a team sport. So although we compete as a team at the games, that's the only time they ever compete as a team. That and the World Equestrian Games. The rest of the time, they are individuals going out to, whether they are dressage, eventing, show jumping, competing against each other. So it's you've got, all of our riders are professional riders, so they run businesses. They are, we have the oldest athlete, and Carl Hester, who's 54. Does Carl need hand holding? Absolutely not. This is his 6th Olympic Games. Does he know how to perform? Yes, absolutely. So I'm working in a sport like hockey, where you've got definitely far more of a team focus. In Tokyo, we hardly had any formal meetings. We had a lot of WhatsApp group communication, and we'd have a lot of meetings, kind of informal meetings in the stables, but a very different approach. And I think, and it just depends on what sport you're in. And I think that's the important thing. I think in anyone coming into this kind of role is you've got to be adaptable, and you've got to be versatile and be able to adapt to whatever that sport requires, and whatever the head coach or the PD, the way they want to work is you need to adapt to that. If whatever support, if you're physio, strength and conditioning, psych, whatever, in my opinion, if you haven't got that ability to be adaptable, you won't survive.
Do you have a preference to which sports that you've worked in then, in terms of that? Have you worked at a number of different games in a variety of sports then?
Yeah, I have. So Beijing was hockey, so I was primary and went there with the British hockey team, which was fantastic, and always say, whilst it was a tough journey, it was many injuries and some tough times for those players. But those players, and again, one of the journeys that we went on with hockey is a lot of those players who had disappointed me in not qualifying. I was meant to go with them to Athens. They didn't qualify for Athens. We then came 5th in Beijing, and then 2012 they won the bronze, and then of course went on to win the gold. And there was a backbone in that team that started with those 4 or 5 players who had immense disappointment back in 2004 to go on to they worked through, and to achieve that gold medal was amazing. And whilst I wasn't working directly with them, there's that relationship with those athletes, those hockey players was absolutely incredible to see those lessons learned to put into what became a highly effective gold medal winning hockey team. So my preference, I'm definitely more of a team player, and I think that's probably reflected on playing sport in a team sport as opposed to an individual sport. So 2008 was with hockey, 2012 and 16 I went with Team GB as part of the core team, the core medical team that go out. And I was quite fortunate in 2012 in that weightlifting didn't have a physio, and nor did modern pentathlon. So whilst I was part of the core, I still had sort of a team that I could step into fairly late but work with them. And that would be my preference, because you do feel more invested than what sometimes happens in a core. So you just really see what any athlete, or you're helping out if there's a lot of injuries in one sport, and you might get called in to do some soft tissue work. So those, and then in 2016, I worked with modern pentathlon, and then was asked to work with Charlotte Desjardins in the equestrian team. And it was on the back of that British Equestrian said, would you come and work with us a couple of days a week to develop the human sports science and medicine? And so I've evolved with them, and then went with them, was chosen to go with them for the Tokyo Olympics. And again, I think for me, it's that it's that investment in that journey. So I joined Equestrian to 2018, and then we've had an extra year, obviously a 3-year build up, and it's really getting to know those riders, those athletes, what makes them tick, which is part of the real. There's definitely a richer journey, and for me personally, and it's not degraded, because you definitely need to have good skills in the Team GB core, because you need to be able to step into any sport at any time. And it's always there as a backfill if something should happen, and particularly obviously with the threat of COVID, that was pretty real this time around. But that would be my preference, I think, is to go on which is why I chose to go back to work in a sport, is to actually go on that journey, apply some of your what you're wanting to bring to a sport, what you're wanting to develop within a sport, all the way through to the games. So that is definitely my preference.
And in terms of Tokyo then, how was that overall experience?
Very different. I mean, really, really different to any of the games that I've been to before. But I genuinely, I think all of us just right up until 2 weeks before didn't think it was going to happen. You know, we kept going through thinking this can't happen. And obviously the numbers were going up. And then when they announced that there was a state of an emergency in Tokyo, thinking, well, how the heck are we going to go? Thousands of people to the state of emergency. But I have to say we'd had that extra year of prep, and part of my focus from a human point of view is that we had to go in there completely no stone left unturned, and real attention to detail in the preparation phase, and having that extra time. And certainly for us as a sport, where it's a sport that, as I said, is pretty individualized, they're professional, they spend a lot of time on the road competing. Actually, COVID was a blessing, because we had more time, actually, ironically, more contact time with the riders to be able to prep them for the games, which I think absolutely came as a positive, and not only the riders, but also the horses, and our horses came through Tokyo unbelievably well. So the big difference, obviously, and the one thing someone asked me that there was your high, what was your high and what was your low? And no matter how much you prepared for, this is going to be a restrictive environment, you're not going to be allowed to walk outside. We opted to stay in the prep camp, so we chose not to go into the village. So Team GB, for those who are not aware, they've got a big prep camp where it's a hotel where every single athlete in Team GB came through the prep camp. Some were 48 hours, some were sort of 4 days. But it's sort of, because of the length of time with the journey, it's 2 days just to breathe, take stock, get yourself prepared, and then most sports would move into the village. We chose not to. We chose to stay in the prep camp because we felt we'd have more control of our environment. We were in a very lucky or fortunate position that we had rooms already booked for our owners, because owners come out with us, but because of COVID, they couldn't travel. So we had these excess 20-odd rooms that we thought, well, actually, if we're not using for owners, why don't we put athletes into them, and we'll stay in the prep camp. So we'd done all of that. We'd spoken about it. We'd spoken about how restricted, and we've done all the webinars about what to expect. And you get there, and it is literally, you're in a hotel. You've got a small space, which BOA had done amazingly to buy some space outside of this hotel, where we were allowed outside between 7 and 10, and you could do a lap of this 200 meter by 5 meter by 200 by 5. And that was the only outside space you could access to walk in or run in. And then you had a balcony outside the restaurant where we had 6 watt bikes. So again, you could book those watt bikes, and that was the only time you could go outside, apart from when you went to your venue. So it was the first 48 hours, I think, was probably the toughest. In getting there, you're fairly travel fatigued. You're having to make decisions. I think everyone, and I'm sure the BO will reflect on this, is every day things changed, and you had to be able to know. And as I said before, I think one of the key things, and the message we kept saying to all of our team, is the team that stays the most flexible, non-reactive. You know that things, we all like to plan. Everyone, in my experience, everyone at this level, whether you're a supporter, whether you're an athlete, you're planning. You've planned for this for 4 years. You go to a games, you've got your everything that you do. I like to know, well, I've got all my kit around me. I know where I'm going to be treating. I know how I can plan my day. and that went out the window because you couldn't, the transport, although again, we got our own vehicles, but you weren't allowed to just change your plan because it had to be documented. And if you got lost, your vehicle was GPSed. So you would get back and you'd have to say, well, you were meant to be here 10 minutes ago. Why weren't you? And they would go into a full inquiry as to why your GPS has gone off track. So those kind of restrictions were really, really, you were escorted everywhere. So you were never, ever on your own. And I think that's probably the biggest reflection is normally at a games, you can go and let off steam, you can go for a run if you want to, in the village, you can, and you couldn't do this in the village either, but you certainly couldn't do it in the hotel, go for a run, go and sit somewhere either with a friend or on your own and have a cup of coffee and just kind of de-stress. And that wasn't the case at all. You were absolutely on top of each other and having to just deal with it and having to really say, well, I've got this plan today, but it may change. And certainly that I think is probably the biggest learning. And I think the teams that did the best out there were those teams that were able to cope with the restriction firstly, mentally, and then also be able to change plans and to be okay with that. I think absolutely crucial for these games of success. And that was very different. That was felt really different. But I will say the BOA were incredible. They were, we had sort of our prep camp was like a home away from home, and they had tried to do as best they could in the hotel to have places where you could have breakout areas, place where you could do sort of inside the hotel where you could do some yoga. There was an immense amount of respect of each other. There was obviously mask wearing all the time, every single minute of the day. But a huge, my real take home from all the sports that were there, and at one stage there were 300 athletes in the hotel at one time, was an enormous amount of respect of each other and being able to keep each other safe. And I think genuinely for Team GB to keep not one positive COVID throughout the games was incredible, absolutely incredible. And that was due to the EIS doing a lot of prep beforehand and a lot of the work around all the testing that we went through, obviously daily testing when we were out there. That's a whole new experience, clearly. And I think then the BOA and the support of that. So it's, I just reflect on a high performance system that is second to none. I don't know the ins and outs of every single system, but I think we're one of the best, if not the best in the world of prepping our athletes, and then certainly getting them through this games was a testament to the system we have in place.
No, absolutely. I mean, that just sounds incredible. You think of that's going on times however many teams and go on. Just what a logistical nightmare.
Oh, and every morning testing. I mean, that's, again, I was reflecting on a trip, again, with hockey it must have been back in sort of 2000, and it was after Beijing. And we decided we wanted to, myself and the strength and conditioning coach and the physiologist decided we wanted to do some cortisol monitoring. So we wanted to do saliva tests in the morning with the players. And oh my word, we needed to do 5 days saliva tests in a row. And you would have thought we were asking them to donate pints of blood every day, and they were really not happy, and we can't. And I was laughing to myself, thinking, and actually Mike was the doc. I said, Mike, do you remember how difficult it was to get, the hockey players to do 5 days in a row saliva? And here, some people are there 21 days, 28 days, every morning spitting, every morning saliva testing, and everyone does it, and obviously you had to. So it's as I say, I mean, incredible. And I reflect, we had 2 positive COVIDs of athletes who didn't actually leave the UK, that were picked up prior to coming, because we had to be tested 14 days, 96 hours and 72 hours before we left. And the reason why, and again, it was a UK sport EIS BOA decision, is no other. We did a 14-day test to see if we could pick up any anomalies. And that's where, unfortunately, 2 athletes were picked up, but they didn't actually travel. So to get through that without any was extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary.
No, absolutely. No, well, it was great to watch. We spoke briefly before we started this and about how amazing it was. And in terms of memorable experiences for you just throughout not just Tokyo, but like your career? Are there any ones that particularly stand out?
Yeah, I think God, there's so many, to be honest. I have to say the one games I didn't mention was going to Sochi. So I went to a Winter Games in 2014, which was I was a late. So I think that's probably one of the most memorable. I worked with someone called John Jackson, who was the driver of the bobsleigh, and he had a complete Achilles rupture in 6 months before the games. So it was August time in 2013. The games were February 2014. And being the driver, obviously a crucial part of the bobsleigh team. And at that stage, I was working at the intensive rehab unit based at Bisham Abbey. And he came in, and they had opted to do the surgery for the first time ever in this country, which was to attach. So normally with a ruptured Achilles, with a sprinter, they're going to be out for at least a year. And there's a surgeon up in Scotland who was doing, it was new in this country, been done quite a lot in America, but basically they put cables through the tendon and then pins into your calcaneum. And that's what basically you've got a artificial Achilles already structured, and then the collagen forms around it. So he came in 1 week post surgery, and I was told you can start getting him out of the splint, and you can start mobilizing him, and that's just unheard of after a rupture. Anyway, so that was one of the highlights, I think, was this complete unknown and complete first time surgery had ever been done, and we had this key date that we needed to get him fit for. And it was on the back of that, the work with him, that come December, January, because it was a night I never traveled with bobsleigh, but they asked if I would consider going to the games with them to allow, because of this consistency of treatment. And without a doubt, one of the highlights of my career, and one of the scariest times of my career, was 2 weeks before the games, where he had to do a flat out sprint. We had to know that he could sprint, and you could have heard a pin drop as we prepared him to do this 20-meter sprint. And John is an ex-Marine, and he could run through a wall. And part of that was going on that journey with him and pushing him, allowing me to push him, and the kind of the levels of complex work that we were doing to try and get this muscle firing, and then for them to really perform. And again, one of the highlights, and also one of the saddest moments of my career, was this bobsleigh team that were sprinting we had the quickest start of any of the bobs, and they came fifth. A Russian team won, and a Russian team came fourth, and everyone was just, how did this happen? In particular, the men's, the Russian team that won, they hadn't performed for years, let alone months. And of course, 6 years later, we know of the huge amount of, and I mean, that's also something that I reflect on, thinking I sat in that room where this huge doping scandal, where they were putting the samples through the wall, and I sat in that very room in doping control. And eventually, 6 years later, they got that medal. They got that bronze medal they deserved to get that day, because we all knew that day that that's what they deserved. That's what they should have got. And they were an absolute highlight of Maker, working with someone like John and the team, coming in really late, and the team, initially, who am I? How can I come in so late? The trust of the PD to say, this is, Ash is coming in. And we went on a quick journey, but an amazing journey of trust. And that was without a doubt a highlight. Unfortunately, 6 years later was when they finally got to stand up at the BOA ball and get their medals. But we knew on that day they deserved that. And we knew that something was happening that wasn't right in Sochi. But of course, it took years to prove it, but eventually they did. So that was something, again, when we talk about planning a career and what you sort of set out, and everyone says, what's your 3 and 5 year plan? Well, that wasn't part of my 3 and 5 year plan, and what a highlight. For me, the disappointment of a team not qualifying. We went as favourites to qualify for the games in 2004 with the hockey, and they didn't qualify. Was really tough. But again, I think I reflect on when that team won the bronze in London, and I was there watching, because I was not working directly with hockey. I was there working as part of the core team, and Kate Richardson Walsh coming out of the changing room, and she said, "You coming into the changing room and you're part of this journey. And that was just a moment, a small thing for her to do. And again, the privilege of working with some of these athletes. Kate had her jaw fractured, second game in, and then had it rewired back on the pitch 4 days later, playing with a significant amount of metalwork in her face, as well as obviously a mask to protect her. And that kind of bravery and just getting out there and doing it for the team is what I love. That's why I still do the work I do, because it's just absolutely amazing. And then I have to say my recent, without a doubt, a highlight, and again, one often thinks those highlights are going to be gold medals, but it's definitely for me around the journey. Charlotte Desjardins was going into Tokyo as a gold medalist in London, gold medalist in Rio, and unfortunately, sort of 5 weeks out, her top horse was pulled out, and she went with this youngster who she sourced 4 years ago, a little horse called Gio, nicknamed Pumpkin, 10 years old, shouldn't be in Olympic Games, still learning to do what he's doing, still, definitely a trajectory for Paris, but not for Tokyo. And this horse got out there, and again, some of the biggest names in the sport. One of the German riders just knocked it out the park for a bronze medal, and it was extraordinary. It was just it was magical to see the trust between no one in that stadium would have thought she could have walked away with the bronze medal. And part of my job that I'm very privileged is about being with those riders or whatever athletes, minutes, hours before they compete, and those discussions and what goes on between that behind closed doors, and seeing that look in someone's face, knowing they're going to go out there and actually they believe they can do it, which is amazing. And I've had that privilege of working with some, just massive privilege of working with some amazing athletes, doing conquering huge stories that often you don't hear about, but they go out and they do it, and that's what I love. I'm extremely privileged to do what I do.
No, I think it's great to hear these stories, because again, as a fan myself, I know all of those names that you've mentioned, but I don't know any of that backstory of any of it. All you tend to see is maybe even 30 minutes, an hour, 10 minutes even on the TV and highlights or whatever it is. So no, it's really good to hear that backstory and all the work that goes into it.
Yeah, I because I do some of I sit in meetings where they use the data. So it's quite well known. It's called Gracenote data, which they'll look at all the stats and they'll do a prediction. And I think our prediction for Gracenote was to come 5th in the medal table, and I think we were only going to deliver 40-odd medals or something, and for the team to deliver what they delivered. And I think I can remember the previous cycle in Rio, sitting in a meeting where they go through all the data, and obviously we have to look at that. We have to look at predictive models, and they were talking about, and I'm sure Catherine Granger won't mind me mentioning this, but again, an athlete I've worked with for many years, and of course she got a gold in London, which was amazing, and then came back to do Rio, and it was a tough journey. It wasn't a straightforward journey at all. And I can remember speaking to her, and they had 50 days to go. And I'd been to a meeting at UK Sport where they'd pretty much written off that crew. They were like, and understandably, it wasn't done in a harsh way. It was, well, actually they were coming 6th and 7th and really not quite achieving what we thought they would. And I remember sitting in a meeting and I was saying, well, no medal. And I sat there listening, and they'd said we were going to deliver, I think it was 54 or something in Rio. And I was like, you forget about the people. And I can remember Catherine saying to me, they had 50 days to go. And instead of going, we've got 50, then 49, then 48, then 47, she said, this is day one. And that day one, day two. So you're not thinking, oh my God, I'm running out of time. It's actually, this is day one of our journey. And her, another highlight without a doubt was her and Vicky Thornley's achievement of a silver, and pretty much that close to getting a gold, where everyone had written them off. And again, it's that look in someone's eyes, and I've seen it, that the Kettridge and Walsh, after having, you know, probably 90% of athletes would say, look, I'm out, you know, I've a massive fracture, huge trauma, and to be able to mentally get back and do that again, absolutely phenomenal. Catherine, to be able to have enough belief that actually this is day one of our, and we've got 50 days to do this, to turn it around. You see it, Charlotte, exactly the same. And I've seen it, fortunately, John Jackson in doing something that certainly, you know, 6 months out, none of us knew if it was possible, because we were all going on this journey together. But I think it's clearly you've got to have the clinical skills, but I think for me, this job is about relationships, and it's about trust, and it's about, you know, walking alongside those athletes and what's meaningful for them, and how can we best help them.
No, I think that's a great time to end on, just with that really positive outlook on it. I'm not going to ask what you can happen in the next 3 or 5 years, because we've had the answer to that one.
I've got an idea, but honestly, I probably shouldn't say that, because we always thought it's really important to have these, and I do always have a vague idea, but my word, I've been incredibly lucky to have some unbelievable surprises along the way. So I think always have a vague plan, but then also be prepared to, as I say, I think definitely the mantra of Tokyo is be flexible and go where your passion takes you. That's the important bit.
No, absolutely. No, that's a great way to end. So thank you very much for giving your time today. Really enjoyed it.
Absolute pleasure.
Yeah, well, I will speak to you soon.
Lovely. Thanks, Andy. Thanks so much.
Right.